Jonas Harvey pushes his cleaning cart into the executive boardroom during a crucial meeting. CFO Richard Connell points and snickers, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere of high-stakes discussion. Janitors know their place after hours, not during million-dollar talks, he says, his words dripping with condescension. Laughter erupts around the room as Richard mimics Jonas's walk, mocking him as though his presence in the room was a joke. Maybe Richard thinks he's qualified to give financial advice. The executives laugh at the sight of the old man in his janitor's uniform, but Jonas stands silently, his dignity intact despite the mockery. CEO Victoria Walsh checks her watch impatiently, clearly irritated by the interruption. "We're discussing the Westfield acquisition," she says, barely glancing in Jonas's direction. "Clear out your trash and yourself." The room erupts in laughter again, as if nothing more than an amusing inconvenience had entered their midst. Jonas nods, seeming to comply with the order. He moves toward the trash bins, but then, without warning, he pulls out his phone. "Actually, I'd like to discuss the acquisition, too," he says, his voice calm and unwavering. The room grows still. Specifically, why it's about to fall apart. The smiles on the executives' faces freeze. Their eyes flick to one another, puzzled by the old janitor's words. As Jonas pulls a folder from beneath his cleaning supplies, a realization dawns in the room, a realization that they might have misjudged him. What would you do if someone humiliated you without knowing your true power? What if the person they belittled had the knowledge to destroy them in seconds? Earlier that morning, Jonas had arrived at Pinnacle Tech's gleaming headquarters in San Francisco. His hands, weathered from years of work, his salt and pepper hair, and his janitor's uniform, a far cry from the tailored suits that once defined his daily wardrobe, created the perfect disguise. At 58, no one recognized a man who had once built a company from nothing 3 decades ago. To them, he was invisible. Jonas pushed his cart through the lobby, observing the company's culture. His purpose was clear: evaluate what had become of the place he once called his own. After receiving disturbing reports about toxic behavior at Pinnacle Tech, the majority shareholder, Jonas himself, had chosen to remain invisible, to witness the authenticity of the company's culture. He knew that sometimes the truth could only be seen when no one was looking. As he passed the CFO's office, Richard Connell called out, "Hey boy, miss a spot there." His voice carried deliberately, the words chosen with intent to belittle. The sound of his laughter echoed through the hallway, drawing chuckles from passing executives who, at that moment, took part in this cruel performance. Jonas didn't respond. He simply nodded respectfully, his eyes downcast as he wiped the already clean floor. This wasn't the first time Jonas had been treated like this, and it wouldn't be the last. Throughout the morning, Richard and his executive clique continued their little game. They dropped papers intentionally for Jonas to collect, ignoring the fact that it was all part of a deliberate effort to degrade him. One executive spilled coffee on the floor, watching Jonas clean it up with a smack, remarking, "That's why you stay in school, folks." It was then that Victoria Walsh, the CEO, witnessed one such incident while walking to a meeting. Her lips tightened disapprovingly as she passed by, but she said nothing, continuing her conversation without interruption. Her silence spoke volumes. Victoria knew what was happening, but she said nothing. In that moment, she chose to ignore the disrespect, allowing it to continue in silence. But what no one in that room knew was that Jonas Harvey had seen it all. He had witnessed the arrogance, the condescension, and the toxic culture that had taken root within the company he built. What they didn't know was that Jonas Harvey was far more than just a janitor. He had been the man behind the rise of Pinnacle Tech. He had been the one to take it from an idea to a multi-million-dollar corporation. He had built this company on values that, over the years, had been forgotten, values of respect, diversity, and integrity. Jonas wasn't just cleaning up floors that morning. He was about to clean up a much bigger mess, the mess created by people who had forgotten what it meant to build something with respect for all people, no matter their position or background. What began as a series of small insults was about to turn into something that none of them could have predicted. Jonas's purpose that morning wasn't just to observe, though. He had a reason for being there. His gut had told him that the Westfield acquisition, a deal that the executives were so certain about, was a disaster waiting to happen. They had been making decisions, pushing agendas, and dismissing things they didn't want to see, critical flaws in their financial projections, discrepancies they didn't want to acknowledge. As the meeting continued, the executives in the room remained unaware of the fact that their carefully curated plans were already on the brink of collapse. They discussed the acquisition in terms of profit margins, market expansion, and corporate synergies. To them, it was just another deal, another checkbox to tick off on the way to even greater profits. They didn't stop to think about the consequences for their employees, their culture, and for the company's legacy. But Jonas Harvey, the janitor they laughed at, saw things differently. He had built this company from the ground up. He understood the financials, the projections, the numbers in ways they couldn't. The mistakes they had made were glaring, but they had missed them. They didn't care to see what was right in front of them. That was where Jonas's true power lay. He knew the company inside out, and he could see the cracks they had ignored. And now, as he stood in front of them, the executives' laughter faltered. They had been laughing at him, but it was about to be the other way around. Jonas had seen enough. He knew exactly how to bring their plans crashing down. With a simple statement, he would expose the flaws, the mistakes, and the hypocrisy of the company's leadership. "Actually, I'd like to discuss the acquisition, too," he had said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Specifically, why it's about to fall apart." And just like that, the tide began to turn. The old janitor, once invisible, had their full attention. The room went silent as Jonas's words hung in the air. What was supposed to be a simple interaction between the janitor and the company's highest-ranking executives had suddenly turned into a moment of reckoning. For a split second, they were all unsure of what to do. Look at the old man in the janitor's uniform, or look away and pretend like nothing was happening. Richard Connell, the CFO, recovered first, but his voice faltered just slightly. He cleared his throat, as if trying to gather some composure. "You're suggesting what, exactly?" "That a janitor is qualified to speak on the acquisition." Jonas didn't flinch. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. He simply walked towards the front of the room, his steady steps echoing in the silence. The executives, the ones who had been laughing at him moments ago, now sat back in their chairs, their eyes fixed on him, unsure of what was to come next. He pulled the folder from beneath his cot, the one he had hidden carefully, and placed it on the polished mahogany table in front of the executives. The sound of the folder landing felt almost deliberate, like the opening of a door that couldn't be closed again. "What if I told you," Jonas began, his voice steady, "that this acquisition, this multi-million-dollar deal you're so proud of, is built on 3 critical mistakes, all of which will doom it before it even begins?" The silence in the room deepened. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, some of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Victoria Walsh, the CEO, checked her watch again, but this time it wasn't out of impatience. It was a nervous gesture. Something in Jonas's tone had caught her attention. Jonas opened the folder, revealing pages of financial projections, charts, and spreadsheets, things that none of them had expected to see in the hands of the janitor. As he started pointing to various figures, explaining how they were incorrect, how they didn't account for key details, something began to shift in the room. The mockery that had once filled the air was now replaced with tension. "Your financial projections for the Westfield acquisition, for instance, are based on overvalued synergies," Jonas continued, his finger tracing a line on one of the charts. "You've assumed that the integration of both companies will happen seamlessly, that Westfield's technology will mesh perfectly with your systems. But the reality is, their technology is outdated, and your infrastructure isn't flexible enough to accommodate the changes. You'll be facing a costly rework, one that you're not budgeting for." Richard's face darkened. He tried to interrupt, but Jonas continued without skipping a beat. "Next," Jonas said, "you've underestimated the integration costs. Westfield's corporate culture is vastly different from yours, and you can't simply wave a magic wand and expect everything to fit. It's not just about firing employees or cutting costs. It's about understanding the human side of the equation. And trust me, if you don't factor that in, it's going to cost you more than just money. You'll lose the loyalty of the talent you're trying to acquire." A few of the executives shifted nervously in their chairs, glancing at each other. Victoria looked uncomfortable, but she was no longer dismissive. She was listening. She had no choice but to listen now. "And last," Jonas said, his voice dropping slightly, You've completely ignored the debt restructuring Westfield went through last quarter. You've missed key indicators in your due diligence. If you're not careful, you'll inherit a mountain of debt that could sink your own company." The room was dead silent now. The only sound was a rustle of papers as Jonas placed a folder down on the table, his eyes scanning the faces in front of him. He had their full attention. Richard was the first to speak again, but his voice was shaky. "You're wrong," he muttered. "These figures are solid. We've been working on them for months." "We?" "No, Richard," Jonas interrupted gently. "You've been working on them for months, but you've been working in the dark. You've been so focused on your own plans, your own projections, that you've ignored the key risks that come with this acquisition. You've ignored the people who will be affected by it, the culture that will crumble when you strip away the very things that made Westfield successful in the first place." The tension in the room had shifted now. There was no more mockery, no more laughter. The executives were looking at one another, unsure of how to proceed. Their smirks had turned into frowns, their confident postures now hunched with uncertainty. Jonas knew he had them. He could feel the weight of their doubt in the air. It wasn't arrogance or pride that made him feel certain. It was a knowledge that he had built this company, seen it rise from the ground, and watched it now teeter on the brink of collapse because of egos like Richard's, people who only cared about profits and didn't care about the company's heart. Jonas walked to the window, his eyes scanning the city below. For a moment, he allowed himself a deep breath, taking in the view of the skyline that he had once looked at from his office on the top floor. He wasn't just a janitor. He had been the one to push this company into the future, to take risks when others were too scared. And now, he was going to do it again, this time with the full power of truth. He turned back to face the executives. "You've been laughing at me. You thought I was just some old janitor, someone you could mock and dismiss. But the truth is, I'm the one who built this. And now, I'm telling you, it's about to fall apart. You can't fix this by throwing numbers on a screen or cutting corners. You need to understand that your decisions are affecting people, real people." Victoria Walsh, the CEO, had been silent until now. She stood up slowly, her gaze shifting between Jonas and the rest of the room. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Are we really that far off?" Jonas met her gaze. "You're not just off. You're about to drive this company into the ground. You ignored the most important things, the people, the culture, the foundation that Pinnacle Tech was built on." Richard Connell opened his mouth to protest, but Victoria held up a hand, silencing him. She looked at Jonas, then back at the board. "We're not moving forward with the acquisition unless we address these issues. Immediately." Jonas didn't need to say anything more. The room had already started to change. The executives, once so confident, were now scrambling to understand the depth of their mistakes. They realized, too late, that they had underestimated the janitor. Jonas had done more than expose their financial flaws. He had exposed their lack of heart, their inability to see the human side of business. And in doing so, he had shifted the very direction of the company he had once built from the ground up. The tension in the boardroom remained thick, the weight of Jonas's revelations hanging in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. The executives, who had been so sure of their path, now sat with their backs slightly hunched, as though a great burden had been placed on their shoulders. Victoria Walsh, the CEO, had just made a statement that would change the course of Pinnacle Tech's future. "We're not moving forward with the acquisition unless we address these issues. Immediately." The boardroom was eerily quiet. Richard Connell, the CFO, who had once mocked Jonas openly, sat with a furrowed brow, his fingers tapping nervously on the surface of the table. His once confident demeanor was now reduced to a shell of uncertainty. The other executives shifted in their seats, unsure of what the next step should be. Jonas, the man they had ridiculed moments earlier, had taken control of the room with nothing more than facts, hard, undeniable facts. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or make a show of his power. His quiet confidence and deep knowledge of the company had done all the talking for him. But as the room remained silent, something else was happening. Outside of that pristine, glass-walled boardroom, the culture of Pinnacle Tech was beginning to shift. The building had once been a fortress of corporate hierarchy and exclusion. Now, Jonas's actions had sent ripples through the very foundation of the company, and those ripples were beginning to spread. The employees of Pinnacle Tech had long been aware of the disconnect between the leadership and the workforce. The company had once prided itself on being a beacon of innovation, a place where creativity and hard work could thrive, regardless of race, gender, or background. But over the years, things had changed. The voices of employees, especially those at the lower levels, had been stifled in favor of profit margins and bottom-line results. Jonas had seen it from the moment he stepped back into the building. The way executives mocked their staff, the disregard for diversity initiatives, and the focus solely on financial gain. It had all become too much for him to ignore. He had witnessed firsthand how toxic the company culture had become, and it was clear that nothing would change unless someone in power made it their mission to address the core issues. Now, thanks to Jonas's intervention, the workers who had once felt powerless were starting to feel a glimmer of hope. A janitor, someone who had been dismissed as invisible, had just taken down the most powerful executives in the room. And though the executives were still reeling from the impact of Jonas's words, the employees outside the boardroom were beginning to talk. Across the office, whispers began to spread. It wasn't just about the janitor turning the tables in the boardroom. It was about something deeper, something about respect, fairness, and recognition. For the first time in a long while, employees felt like their voices mattered. They felt like they weren't just pawns in a corporate game, but integral pieces of the company's success. Jonas's actions had sparked a sense of accountability, not just for the executives, but for everyone in the building. The day Jonas exposed the flaws in the acquisition plan wasn't just a wake-up call for the leadership. It was a moment of reckoning for the entire company. Employees who had suffered in silence for too long, overlooked and disrespected, began to realize that change was possible. If a janitor could stand up to the powers that be and shift the course of the company, why couldn't they? Back in the boardroom, Richard Connell was fuming. His hands gripped the edges of the table as he stared at Jonas, his face flushed with anger. "You think you can just come in here and—" He stopped mid-sentence, the words failing him. Victoria, who had been quiet for the past few moments, turned to Richard. "Enough, Richard," she said sharply, her voice now carrying the weight of authority that had been missing moments earlier. "We're not going forward until we fix what's broken here. The Westfield acquisition is on hold. We'll take a step back and reassess everything." Richard's face darkened, but he didn't argue. The rest of the executives remained silent, their discomfort palpable. They all knew that Jonas had exposed something they couldn't ignore anymore. As the meeting wound down, Victoria turned to Jonas. "We need to talk, but not here. I think we need to have a real conversation about the future of this company." Jonas simply nodded. He knew what was at stake now. He had done what he came to do, expose the lies, the arrogance, the ignorance that had been driving the company toward destruction. But the real work was just beginning. It wasn't enough to point out the flaws. Change needed to happen. And it would only happen if the leadership was willing to listen and act on what was uncomfortable and difficult. The meeting broke up, and the executives scattered in different directions, no longer the confident leaders they once were, but a group of people unsure of their next steps. Outside the boardroom, the energy in the building had changed. Employees who had once walked the halls with their heads down, hoping to avoid attention, now walked a little taller. They shared knowing glances, the kind that come from realizing they had witnessed something monumental. In the cafeteria, a group of workers discussed the events of the day. "Did you hear what happened in the boardroom?" one of them asked, her voice barely a whisper. The janitor, he just destroyed them. He knew everything. It was like they were all blind to it. Another employee nodded, his eyes wide. "I never thought anyone would have the guts to call them out." But Jonas, he wasn't just cleaning the floors. He was cleaning up their mess. As the day wore on, more and more employees began to feel emboldened. They had seen something no one had expected. A man they had all walked past every day, someone they had considered just another face in the crowd, had just toppled the corporate giants in a matter of minutes. The truth was undeniable. There was power in understanding, power in perspective, and most importantly, power in standing up for what was right. But as the building buzzed with a new energy, Jonas took a quiet moment to himself. He knew this was just the beginning. He hadn't come here to embarrass the executives, though that was certainly a satisfying side effect. No, he had come here to remind them, and everyone, that power didn't always look the way they expected it to. And now, As Jonas walked down the hallway, a sense of quiet triumph washed over him. He had done his part. The battle for Pinnacle Tech's future was just beginning, but one thing was clear. The old janitor had made sure the company would never be the same again. The atmosphere at Pinnacle Tech was charged with uncertainty, but also with something new, the sense that change was not only necessary, it was inevitable. As Jonas Harvey stepped out of the boardroom, he felt the weight of the moment settle in. He hadn't just exposed flaws in a business deal. He had triggered a revolution. For the first time in a long while, the employees of Pinnacle Tech were awake to the reality that they had the power to reshape their own futures. The path forward would not be easy, but it was clear now that there was no going back. Jonas knew this wouldn't be solved with a single meeting or a few strategic decisions. The issues at Pinnacle ran deeper than just bad projections or misguided financial calculations. What he had exposed that day was a toxic culture, a culture that valued profit above all else, and worse, ignored the people who had made the company great in the first place. This wasn't just about restructuring a deal, it was about reconstructing the heart of the company itself. If the leadership truly wanted to move forward, they had to confront what had been swept under the rug for so long. Later that afternoon, Jonas sat in a quiet corner office, now flanked by Victoria Walsh, the CEO, and Diane Rodriguez, the HR director. They were finally going to have a conversation that had been a long time coming. Victoria had called him in, her tone different than before. This wasn't a conversation about corporate deals or profits anymore. It was about the company's soul. "I'll be honest," Victoria said, her voice cautious but firm. "You've shaken us all up today, Jonas. But you've also made me realize something. We've ignored the culture for far too long. I've been complicit in that, turning a blind eye. But what you said today, reminded me of why this company was built in the first place. And we've lost that along the way." Jonas nodded slowly, but he wasn't here to make her feel better. He was here to make real change. "It's not enough to say you've lost a culture," he replied, his voice steady. "You've allowed it to die by focusing on the wrong things. Profit is important, sure, but it's not everything. You built this company on values that included people, not just numbers. You've forgotten what made Pinnacle Tech different from the others in Silicon Valley, the respect for diversity, for innovation, for understanding the value of each individual in the company." Victoria sighed, looking down at her hands. She knew he was right. She had let herself become too focused on the big picture, too concerned with deals, acquisitions, and financial projections to notice the decay at the core of the company. She had watched as the culture shifted, but she hadn't done enough to stop it. She had been a part of the problem. "I want to change that, Jonas," she said finally, her eyes meeting his. "I want to fix this, but I don't know where to start." Jonas leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "The first step is simple. You need to listen. Listen to the people who are on the ground, the people who make this company run. Stop pretending that only the boardroom has the answers. If you really want change, it has to come from everyone." Victoria nodded. She was beginning to see that this wasn't about grand gestures or corporate branding. It was about stripping away the layers of pretense and getting to the core of what had been lost. The executives at Pinnacle Tech had become so focused on efficiency and results that they had forgotten about the people who drove those results. But even though she understood, Victoria knew that this was just the beginning. A cultural shift wasn't something that could be implemented overnight. It would require trust between the leadership and the employees. And for that to happen, the leadership had to prove that they were willing to change, to put people first again. Jonas was silent for a moment, letting the weight of the conversation settle. Finally, he spoke again, but this time his words were focused. "If you want to move forward, you have to take action. You need to evaluate everything. The hiring processes, the promotions, the way decisions are made. You need to make sure that the people who were overlooked, the people who were treated like they didn't matter, get the opportunities they deserve. And you have to make sure that the leadership you have in place understands this." Diane, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Jonas is right. We've created a system that values compliance over creativity, speed over thoughtfulness. But we've also created a toxic environment where people fear speaking up, where minorities, women, and those with unconventional backgrounds feel like they don't belong." Victoria turned to Diane, her face serious. "What do you suggest?" Diane didn't hesitate. We need to rebuild trust. That means being transparent about what's happened. Admit that we failed in certain areas and show the employees that we're committed to fixing it. And we need to empower the people in the lower ranks, the ones who have been ignored for too long. They are the ones who have the best insight into what's really wrong with this company. Jonas nodded in agreement. Exactly. Start by listening to the voices of the people who know what's broken. There's no shame in admitting you've been wrong, but there's no point in pretending everything is fine either. You need to be honest with your employees, and more importantly, with yourselves. Victoria's mind was racing. She had always considered herself a strong leader, but today, Jonas had shown her that strength didn't always come from making decisions at the top. Sometimes, the real strength came from facing the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. I'm willing to make these changes, she said quietly, but it won't be easy. Some of the people at the top won't be happy with this. They won't want to shift away from what's been working for them for years. Jonas smiled slightly. That's the point. If you're going to make a real change, you have to be willing to lose the people who aren't ready to change. They are the ones who've kept the company in the past. If you want to move forward, you'll have to leave some people behind. The weight of his words didn't escape her, but in that moment, Victoria understood what needed to be done. She had been caught up in the illusion of control, thinking that the company was Hayes to command, but it wasn't. The company belonged to everyone, from the janitors to the executives. And now, it was time to put those who had been ignored back at the center of the company's vision. I'll start by addressing the board, Victoria said, determination rising in her voice. We'll begin a full review of our company culture, hiring practices, and leadership structure. This will not be just another empty promise. It's time to walk the walk. Jonas stood, ready to leave the office. Good. But remember this, Victoria, this change can't be just for show. It has to be real. It has to come from the heart of the company. And it starts with you. As Jonas walked out of the office, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The battle was far from over, but today he had begun to shift the tide. The real work would take time, and it would take effort from everyone, but the seeds of change had been planted. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. It would require hard conversations, tough decisions, and a willingness to look at a company honestly, flaws and all. But Jonas knew one thing for certain. Pinnacle Tech had the potential to be great again. All it needed was the courage to face the truth and the willingness to rebuild one step at a time. The next few days at Pinnacle Tech were nothing short of transformative. What had started as a day of embarrassment and revelation had quickly turned into a rallying cry for the company's employees. Jonas Harvey's unexpected intervention had sparked a fire that no one could ignore. And now, the real work of rebuilding the company's culture was about to begin. Jonas knew that it wasn't just about the executives understanding the mistakes they had made. It was about making the employees believe that change could really happen. It wasn't going to be enough to sit in boardrooms and have intellectual conversations about diversity, inclusion, and respect. The real work had to happen on the ground, where people felt the most ignored, where the culture had poisoned the hearts of the workforce. For Jonas, this meant that change had to come from both the leadership and the employees themselves. As the days unfolded, the employees at Pinnacle Tech began to see the difference in their leadership. Victoria Walsh, the CEO, wasted no time in addressing the entire company. It was a town hall meeting, something that was rare in a company as large as Pinnacle Tech. But Victoria, who had once been so distant, now knew she had to connect directly with her employees. The announcement was simple, but powerful. We have made mistakes, Victoria began, standing in front of the crowd with a resolve that was new to her. Our culture has been broken, and it's time for us to fix it. We've overlooked the very things that made Pinnacle Tech special. Innovation thrives when every voice is heard, not just the ones at the top. The room, filled with employees from various departments, sat quietly. Some were skeptical, others hopeful, but all of them were waiting for what would come next. It wasn't just talk anymore. They had heard promises before, empty words from leaders who wanted to seem progressive without making real changes. But this time, something was different. We will be implementing a series of changes starting today, Victoria continued. First, we are launching a comprehensive review of our diversity and inclusion programs. This review will be led by Diane Rodriguez, our new Chief Diversity Officer. We will also be conducting anonymous surveys across all levels to hear from every employee about what needs to be fixed. This is just a beginning, but it's a start. Diane stood beside Victoria as she spoke. She had been with the company for years, but under Richard Connell's leadership, she had been sidelined, her efforts dismissed. But now, in this moment, Diane was given the responsibility to lead the charge in transforming the company's culture. As she stepped forward to speak, there was a sense of pride in her voice. "We've created a culture of silence," Diane began, "where people were afraid to speak up, to question decisions. We've ignored the voices of those who could have made Pinnacle Tech stronger. That changes today. We will be listening, and we will be acting. You won't be ignored anymore." Her words resonated with the employees in the room. They could feel the sincerity in her voice, and it was clear that the winds of change were blowing through the company. But it wasn't just a leadership that was making waves. The employees themselves were beginning to see that their voices mattered. Throughout the building, workers who had long been silenced began to speak up. In the break rooms, on the elevators, even in the hallways, employees were sharing their experiences, stories of discrimination, of feeling overlooked, of being dismissed simply because of their background, race, or gender. These were the voices that had been ignored for too long. And now, they were finally being heard. Jonas watched this from the sidelines, his role in the process now shifting from challenger to mentor. He had done his part in exposing the issues, but the real transformation would come from within the company. He had opened the door, but it was up to the employees and leadership to walk through it together. As the weeks passed, the leadership team at Pinnacle Tech began to work closely with Diane and the Diversity Task Force. They pored over the survey results, identifying the key areas where the company's culture had failed. There was a clear pattern. Employees in lower positions felt disregarded, their voices were ignored, and their contributions undervalued. There was also a significant gap in the way that minorities and women were treated compared to their white male colleagues. Promotions, performance reviews, and salary increases all reflected this disparity. But the leadership didn't shy away from this reality. Instead, they took accountability, acknowledging the company's failure and committing to change. The first step was addressing the hiring practices, which had long been skewed in favor of a certain demographic. Diane's team worked on creating a blind recruitment process where candidates' names, genders, and ethnicities were removed from resumes and applications. This way, they could focus purely on skills and experience rather than unconscious bias. In addition to this, a new training program was rolled out for managers and executives. They were required to undergo diversity and inclusion training, but it wasn't just about ticking boxes. The training focused on understanding privilege, identifying biases, and learning how to lead with empathy. The days of cutting corners and focusing solely on profits were over. Now, the leaders at Pinnacle Tech were being taught how to lead with people at the forefront of their minds. Meanwhile, the employees were engaged in the process as well. The company held monthly forums where employees could speak freely about their experiences, share concerns, and offer suggestions. These forums were facilitated by Diane's team, ensuring that every voice was heard. But the forums weren't just about airing grievances. They were about coming up with actionable solutions. Pinnacle Tech wasn't just going to listen. They were going to act on what was said. As the transformation continued, the company's culture began to shift in subtle but significant ways. The once cold, impersonal hallways were now filled with more conversation, laughter, and collaboration. Employees felt more comfortable sharing their ideas in meetings, knowing that their voices would be respected. Even the executives, once so distant from the daily operations, began to show up in the break rooms, engaging with employees in a way they hadn't before. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was about the people who did it. One of the most notable changes came in the form of a new mentorship program, which paired younger employees with senior leaders to help foster growth, not just in skills but in relationships. The mentorship wasn't just about career development. It was about understanding each other's struggles, aspirations, and experiences. The program gave employees a direct line to the leadership, breaking down the hierarchical walls that had separated them for so long. Jonas watched all of this unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. He wasn't involved in the day-to-day work anymore, but the change was real. He had sparked the conversation, but it was the people of Pinnacle Tech who were making it happen. Then, as if the company needed one more reminder that things had changed, word came that a new round of hires had been completed. For the first time in years, a significant portion of the new hires came from diverse backgrounds: women, people of color, and individuals from underrepresented communities. The company had committed to building a workforce that reflected the world it served. And so, the company continued to move forward, one step at a time, rebuilding the foundation that had been cracked by years of neglect. The road wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way, but the commitment was clear. Pinnacle Tech was no longer the company it had been. It was evolving, growing, and learning. Jonas Harvey had come to Pinnacle Tech with one purpose: to expose the truth. But what he had left behind was something far greater. A company that had lost its way was now on the path to something better. And it was only just the beginning. Months passed, and the transformation at Pinnacle Tech began to take shape in ways no one could have predicted. The changes that had initially been met with skepticism by both the leadership and employees were starting to yield tangible results. It was no longer just about the meetings, the training programs, or the policies. It was about the people who had felt marginalized, unheard, and unseen for so long now beginning to thrive. It was about the leadership team shifting from a profit-first mindset to a people-first one. And it was about the culture of the company becoming not just a talking point, but a genuine part of its identity. The mentorship program that had started as a simple initiative to bridge the gap between leadership and employees had taken off beyond expectations. Employees who had once felt invisible now found themselves not only heard but valued. Young professionals, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds, were rising within the company, their talents finally recognized by the very people who had once disregarded them. It was a quiet revolution, but one that was reshaping the entire workforce at Pinnacle Tech. The hiring practices, once criticized for their lack of diversity, had undergone a complete overhaul. The blind recruitment system that had been put in place now ensured that the hiring process was based solely on merit, not on unconscious biases. For the first time in years, the diversity of the company's new hires reflected the diversity of the broader world. Women and people of color were making up a significant percentage of new hires in both technical and managerial roles. The results were clear. By actively ensuring that everyone had a fair chance to succeed, Pinnacle Tech was attracting some of the brightest talent in the industry. And the impact wasn't limited to internal changes. Word spread throughout the industry that Pinnacle Tech was undergoing a cultural renaissance. Once known for its toxic corporate culture, the company was now being hailed as an example of how to rebuild a broken workplace. Industry blogs and major tech publications began writing about Pinnacle's transformation, showcasing it as a case study for other companies looking to make real, sustainable changes to their own cultures. At a major tech conference in Silicon Valley, an executive from a competing company took the stage to discuss the challenges of building an inclusive culture. He spoke candidly about the difficulties his company faced, including its struggles with diversity and employee engagement. But then, he paused, his tone shifting. "We've been watching Pinnacle Tech," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "What they've done in the past few months is nothing short of remarkable. We're taking notes." That comment was just the tip of the iceberg. Other companies in the tech space, particularly those with long histories of diversity struggles, began to reach out to Pinnacle Tech. They wanted to know how the company had turned things around so quickly and effectively. Pinnacle's leaders, who had once been preoccupied with board meetings and acquisitions, now found themselves in high demand at conferences, webinars, and consulting engagements, sharing their experience with anyone willing to listen. Victoria Walsh, who had once been a CEO with little connection to her employees, was now a sought-after voice in the corporate world. Her speeches on leadership, culture, and inclusion were now a regular feature at business conferences and in academic circles. Her approach was simple but powerful: listen to your employees, respect them, and put people at the heart of everything you do. But Victoria also knew that the transformation wasn't over. The work Pinnacle had done was just the beginning. The company was still learning, still growing, still working to make sure the changes were not just surface level but integrated into the very fabric of the organization. The road ahead was long, but the commitment was real. The leaders at Pinnacle Tech understood that this wasn't a trend. It was a fundamental shift in how business was done, and they were committed to making it work. Internally, the impact was even more evident. Employee engagement was at an all-time high, with surveys showing an unprecedented sense of satisfaction and belonging. People who had once felt like cogs in the machine now felt like they were part of something bigger. They understood that their work mattered, not just for the company's bottom line, but for the culture they were helping to build. A culture that valued diversity of thought, background, and experience. A culture that encouraged innovation and creativity from all corners of the organization. The company's leadership also began to understand that accountability was key. The diversity training programs, once a checkbox on a list of corporate responsibilities, had now become an ongoing, integrated part of the company's operations. Executives and managers were expected to engage in regular conversations about diversity, inclusion, and workplace culture. It wasn't just about one-time seminars or quick fixes. It was about ongoing learning and accountability at every level. In fact, the company had gone so far as to create an inclusion council made up of employees from various departments, backgrounds, and levels of experience. This council worked alongside the executive team to ensure that the changes being implemented were truly effective. If any issues or concerns arose, the Inclusion Council was the first line of communication, giving the workforce a direct channel to leadership. The results didn't take long to show. Pinnacle Tech's performance in the market began to reflect the cultural changes. Employee retention was at its highest level in years, and turnover rates, which had previously been a major issue, dropped significantly. Customers, too, took notice. They saw that Pinnacle Tech wasn't just talking about inclusion, it was living it. This resonated deeply with a customer base that was increasingly prioritizing ethical practices in the companies they chose to do business with. Pinnacle's stock price, which had once been stagnant, began to climb steadily, and industry analysts took note of the company's renewed focus on innovation and sustainable growth. But perhaps the most telling sign of Pinnacle's transformation was the influx of talent. It wasn't just about hiring diverse candidates, it was about hiring the best. And with a new, more inclusive environment, Pinnacle Tech was attracting some of the brightest minds in the industry. Engineers, product managers, and designers from top-tier companies were now looking to Pinnacle Tech as a place where they could truly make an impact. Jonas Harvey, the man who had started this whole process, watched all this unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. He hadn't done it for the accolades or the recognition. He had done it because he knew that it was the right thing to do. He knew that companies, no matter how successful, could never thrive unless they treated everyone, no matter their role, no matter their background, like they mattered. One afternoon, as Jonas walked through the newly redesigned halls of Pinnacle Tech, he passed by a group of young employees discussing a new project. They were laughing, brainstorming, and collaborating in a way that was unrecognizable from the rigid, hierarchical environment that had once existed. For a moment, Jonas paused, watching them. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was the one who had reminded them all of what was truly important. And now, as the company grew and evolved, he knew that Pinnacle Tech would never go back to the way it was before, or as Pinnacle Tech continued to evolve. It soon became clear that the company was no longer just a business. It had become a symbol, a beacon for others in the corporate world, a living proof that a shift in culture could not only fix internal problems, but also enhance long-term success. The transformation that had begun with Jonas Harvey's quiet yet powerful intervention had grown into something far larger than anyone had anticipated. The employees, once disillusioned and marginalized, now felt a renewed sense of ownership and pride. They had not only survived the internal crisis, they had thrived because of it. Every corner of the office, every department, now felt like it had a pulse, a sense of collective purpose that was driven by inclusivity and mutual respect. As Pinnacle Tech reached new milestones in revenue and customer satisfaction, it wasn't just because of the new technologies they were developing. It was because they had built a company where innovation was driven by a diverse team that felt empowered and valued. Victoria Walsh, the CEO who had once been an aloof leader, was now seen as a guiding force in the company's cultural revolution. Her leadership had been challenged, her decisions questioned, and yet she stood unwavering, determined to rebuild from the inside out. She knew this change wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a foundation for the company's future. Under Victoria's guidance, Pinnacle Tech became a model for other corporations. The company's renewed commitment to diversity wasn't just a marketing tool or a box to check off. It had become a core pillar of its business strategy. It was no longer just about compliance with regulations or external expectations. It was about a fundamental belief in the power of diverse voices and perspectives to drive innovation and growth. The company's efforts to diversify had also caught the attention of industry leaders. At a prestigious tech conference, Victoria was invited to speak about the company's turnaround and the cultural changes that had made it successful. As she took the stage, the crowd was full of anticipation. People had watched Pinnacle Tech's journey and were eager to hear the secret to their success. Victoria stood tall at the podium, her confidence a stark contrast to the woman who had once been unsure of her position as CEO. "When we began this transformation," she said, her voice calm and steady, "we didn't just change policies. We changed the way we think about leadership, about talent, about what makes a company truly successful. It's not enough to focus solely on profits. You have to focus on people, on their potential. When you give people the space to grow, when you let them bring their full selves to the table, you'll be amazed at the results." Her words resonated across the audience, many of whom were from major tech companies struggling with similar issues. She wasn't just offering solutions. She was providing a roadmap for others to follow. And the impact of her message didn't stop there. Other companies, large and small, began to reach out to Pinnacle Tech for guidance, eager to learn how they, too, could replicate the company's success. But even with all the accolades, the real legacy of Pinnacle Tech's transformation was seen in the workplace itself. The company had implemented processes and structures that ensured inclusivity wasn't just a buzzword, but a reality. The Inclusion Council, which had been formed in the early days of the company's cultural shift, had become a permanent fixture within the organization. Its members, a diverse mix of employees from all backgrounds and departments, met regularly to ensure that the company continued to evolve and improve. The council wasn't just about fixing problems as they arose. It was about proactively creating a culture of belonging. They identified areas where the company could improve, whether it was in the recruitment process, employee training, or day-to-day operations. They worked hand in hand with leadership to implement initiatives that would foster diversity, equity, and inclusion at every level. Employee resource groups, which had once been relegated to the sidelines, were now central to the company's community-building efforts. These groups weren't just places for people to gather. They were places where employees could learn, grow, and make their voices heard. The company had gone from having a handful of diversity initiatives to having a comprehensive, multifaceted approach to inclusivity that was embedded into the company's fabric. And it wasn't just the employees who felt the effects of this change. Pinnacle Tech's customers, too, began to notice. The company's renewed commitment to diversity wasn't just a cultural change. It was a business advantage. Customers who cared about ethics, sustainability, and social justice saw the company's transformation as a sign of its commitment to those values. Pinnacle's customer base grew, and with it, their reputation in the industry. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of Pinnacle's transformation was how quickly it had spread. Other industries, especially those with long-standing issues related to diversity and inclusion, began to look to Pinnacle Tech as a guide. Corporate culture had always been difficult to change, but Pinnacle showed that it was possible. Jonas Harvey, now a quiet presence in the background, watched the company's evolution from a distance. He had done what he set out to do. He had exposed the truth. He had forced the company to confront its own failings, and in doing so, he had sparked a movement. But he never sought the credit. For him, it was always about the people, the ones who had been ignored, the ones who had been overlooked. He had always believed that true power wasn't about holding a title or making the big decisions. It was about standing up for what was right, even when no one was watching. As Jonas walked through the halls of Pinnacle Tech one last time, he noticed something. The employees, the ones who had once felt disconnected from the company, were now smiling, collaborating, and making decisions together. The culture was different. It was inclusive, it was innovative, and it was a culture that had real impact. Jonas stepped into the elevator, taking a moment to reflect. The ride up to the top floor, where he once held a corner office, felt different. He wasn't there as a CEO or even as an advisor. He was simply a part of the company's legacy, a quiet reminder of how far they had come. And as the doors of the elevator closed, Jonas Harvey knew that he had given the company something far more valuable than any financial projection or business deal. He had given it the chance to be great again, not just in terms of profits, But in terms of people, Pinnacle Tech would never be the same again. But now, it was better.